Hi, welcome to Breadonomics. In this video, I'm going to break down the final question of the 2024 external exam for economics in Queensland. Extended response, 21 marks of the 60 for the exam, 400 to 600 word response. I actually quite like this question. I think it's really well written and very clear in what it asks you to do, and I think it doesn't overwhelm you with data. So let's get into it. Use sources 1 to 8 to analyse the economic issue, evaluate demand side and a supply side approach being taken by Australian governments. Then draw a conclusion about which approach is more effective using the criterion or the perspective of future employment. Here's the structure I'm going to use today. Step 1, know your question. 2, we're going to think about our response structure. Step 3, use your data and economic theory to analyse, then do the same to evaluate, and finally use your data and economic theory to make your conclusions. Step 1 is to know your question. You must use all the data sources. They're all relevant. There's no red herrings in here. There's no duds. You have to analyse an economic issue. To analyse, we want to identify the economic issue. There may be more than one. Use our data analysis to justify why it's a problem. And thirdly, start to think about a rationale for your government intervention using economic theory. The next step is then to evaluate the demand side, which is we're going to call option 1. And so we evaluate option 1, thinking through the costs and benefits, using our analysis of data and once again reflecting back on economic theory to justify our reasoning. Then do the same for option 2, your supply side. Figure out your costs and benefits, and some may be relevant in the data, and then others will link back to your understanding of theory. The final step is to draw your conclusions about which approach is more effective. And that's a big hint there, more effective, from the perspective of creating future employment. You must, in your conclusion, consider the relative merits of both options. You may also want to think about your stakeholder outcomes on households, firms, and government. Based on that examination of relative merits, make your decision on which option is most effective and provide detailed reasoning. And if you've done some good steps in your evaluate option 1 and evaluate option 2, you'll then have all the reasoning present to actually create that justification. Finally, it's always worth inserting a comment or a commentary on any limitations or caveats, potentially limitations in the scope of the data available, or potentially there may be some caveats or some limitations evident in the data of taking on that approach. So knowing our question leads us to be able to create a clear response structure. And that's why I really like this question, because it guides you to this scaffold very, very well. And I've just laid it out there in a flowchart for you. Take a moment just to pause the video here, take your notes on this, because what I'd be wanting to think about doing when I got into the external exam is to write this down on my planning paper straight away. And so now I have to set out my analysis. And we can see that the stimulus material provided relates to global weather events and electricity generation from renewable and non-renewable sources, in a nutshell. To scaffold my analysis, my first step is to identify the economic issue. And there may be more than one, so be open-minded on these ones. Make sure you have a good and read through your stimulus material before you start thinking about what the problems are. The second step is to think about how you know it's a problem and how can you use the data to justify why it's a problem. Identify your similarities and differences in data, quantify and calculate trends and percentage changes, and the likely effects of the problems, so infer meaning. So the first step now is to first of all say which data sets link through to identifying and justifying the issues that I see. And finally, you may want to write a section of explaining why the government should intervene in the market, where there may be a market failure present, for example. So the data sets that link through to this first stage of analysis is source 1, the change in extreme global weather events. Source 4, the second sentence kind of links to that as well. And then the source 6 and 5 sort of talk about this idea that we still are primarily using non-renewable sources. And so now we can see that we've got two problems, and we know how they're problems because we can see some changes and we can then see some data linking as to effects, for instance, in global weather events. And similarly, but in terms of source 5 and source 6, we said the reliance on carbon emitting non-renewables linking through to source 6. Its trend in non-renewable is falling, but it's still the most significant source of our power generation. And so now we can see it's probably a good time to think about governments intervening in markets to correct the market failure of the pollution that's created and the global warming and the weather events and all that kind of stuff. Step 4 is to use your data and your theory to evaluate. And we'll look at option 1 first, the demand side. And there's really only one data set that sits to this, and it's this one, source number 3, which gives you information about subsidies and costs of solar systems. So we have to try and use this data set and our understanding of economic theory to think through some of the costs and benefits and likely outcomes on some of our major sort of economic indicators. So what I've done here is I've inserted a supply and demand diagram. Now the AS curve is just a straight line just for convenience, but you may want to draw it with a long run and a short run aggregate supply, or you may want to do it with a Keynesian style curved aggregate supply curve. But the inferences that we can create are kind of the same. Any subsidies that governments put onto products will induce demand. Any inducement of demand would see a shift of the demand curve to the right. A shift to demand curve of right is likely going to leave it at some point is going to lead to higher prices, increase in price level, and also an increase in GDPR, real GDP, increase in consumption. So the benefit we see here is the increase in consumption, increase in GDP. Potential costs are inflationary effects. So I can start to think about the changes on inflation. Employment may create some more jobs into solar panel industry as well. But also consider at this point, go deep into your theory here. Changes in aggregate demand are generally cyclical in nature. They're generally short run. So we'll see a change in economic activity for a period of time. But if the subsidies were to be removed, for example, we'd see that aggregate demand would probably shift back to its original curve position. And that's where you can start to link your understanding of the models to how these economic models and these theories flow into the real world, and then think about those effects on those major indicators of inflation, employment, and real GDP, understanding we're talking short-run change or cyclical change here from a demand side at this point. We can then consider the supply side costs and benefits. And there's only one source for this as well, and that relates to a large expansion to the power grid, $5 billion project, and a huge deposit of critical minerals worth an estimated $500 billion. It all seems very current after the events of the last week with Albanese and Trump getting together and signing critical minerals deals. But here we'd see from a supply side a shift of the aggregate supply curve to the right. So there may be some disinflationary or deflationary pressure in the economy, a drop in the price level, aligned with an increase in GDP. Thinking this through to our economic theory, we can also look at this and suggest that potentially there's some long run or structural increase in our level of economic growth as compared to the demand side, which is likely more cyclical, linked to economic activity, expansion of the economic cycle. So we'd see here an increase in the productive capacity of our economy over the long run. And once again, examine these changes from the perspective of inflation, employment, and real GDP output. Our final step is to use our data and theory to make our conclusions. And we can see now that we've used all the sources up to source 6, which leaves us with a couple of sources available for our conclusion. We need to think clearly about creating future employment as our criteria. We'd want to make sure that we consider the relative merits of both options and consider stakeholder outcomes, households, firms, and governments. Make your decision on which option is most effective. Both will have some positive effects. The challenge for you is to discern which is going to be most effective or more effective. And that's where you start to provide that detailed reasoning, deep justification, and linking it through to economic theory. Before we look at the marking guide for this question, it's prudent just to review once again this extended response structure that I'd recommend you attempt to use in extended exams if you feel it suits the question. Analysing, identifying the issue, justifying why it's a problem, think about the rationale for governments getting involved. Evaluate option 1, then evaluate option 2, costs and benefits of both, linking back to your economic theory to justify your reasons. And finally, your conclusion. Be clear on your criteria. Ensure that you consider the relative merits of both options and think about your stakeholder outcomes. Make your decision on which option is most effective, provide some detailed reasoning, and think about any limitations or caveats think about any limitations or caveats that you may want to place upon the scope of your analysis. So now in reviewing the marking guide, we can see that for the analysing component of the question, clearly outlines that you have to identify the economic issue with the problems, linking that through to breaking down the data that relates to the weather events and the electricity generation. It's important to note that in those responses, it asks you to quantify changes using data and dates, percentage changes, and picking up on trends. It also importantly asks you to add meaning to the damage caused with some detail, adding meaning to the data. So trying to find those links between data sets where it starts to give you some idea of cause and effect. In evaluating, following our response structure, we see that the demand side approach asks you to use the data to explain how solar subsidies stimulate the economy, provide some detail and added explanation, potentially linking it through to your aggregate demand and aggregate supply outcomes. Then synthesizing a relevant idea or perspective. This is where you can consider elements such as the cyclical nature of demand side changes, linking it through to short run outcomes. That will help you make some sort of general themes in terms of where you might be heading into your conclusion in your evaluation. Similarly, for the supply side, you can then think about, from the supply side, you could also argue that there's potentially more long-run implications or more structural improvements to the economy, leading to long-run GDP growth. When it comes to making your final evaluation, we can see here you make some decisions about the effectiveness of both the demand and the supply side approaches using that criteria of future employment. So both will have some relative merit, and you have to be clear in expressing that. Provide your economic reasoning once again in terms of your final decision, and then make your valid decision. And so by flowing through the process of getting to that point and breaking your data down, you'll come up with some pretty detailed reasoning. So that's it, the final video of the 2024 Economics External Exam. I hope you found these videos helpful. Please share them with your friends, give it a like, questions or comments below, and all the best with the final push before the external exam. Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Bye.